I hate horror. I hate horror movies, horror games, horror anything. Halloween is my least favorite holiday, and there isn't a thing about horror that I like. For this reason, if you had told me a year ago that Friday the 13th was going to be one of my favorite games of 2017, I wouldn't have believed you. But here we are, and here I am with 63 hours in the game, a number that's still going up. So what gives? Do I like horror now? Well, no, of course not, and I don't much see that changing. Now, the truth is a little more strange than that. The fact of the matter is that no matter how much I play the game, I can't buy the idea that Friday the 13th is a horror game. I know that sounds kinda silly, and I won't lie, it is, but honestly, the scariest thing about this game is Eric LaChappa's floppy arms. To truly demonstrate why I don't think Friday the 13th is a horror game, let's first try to define horror. If you've seen my video, What's with Runners, you know that this is a fruitless task, but I think we can, at the very least, make a clear distinction between what Friday the 13th is versus what a horror game is. A lot of people may disagree with me on the following premise. To me, a horror game is a game that is scary. Now, what scares you will vary from person to person. If a game scares you, I won't try to convince you that it doesn't. But I personally believe that this game, both mechanically and aesthetically, has been designed to not provide a scary experience. So what is scary? Again, this will vary from person to person, but there are 3 scare tactics I'm going to address here. The first is anticipation. It's the feeling we get when we expect something to happen, whether it will or not. Most horror games have this, like in PT, where the player repeatedly walks down a hallway. Little things are changing about the hallway each time, to the point at which we expect something drastic to happen sooner or later. This anticipation manifests, and players will often find themselves hesitating to turn this same corner, dreading that there may be something or someone there. The second is jump scare. This is when something, usually unexpected, happens suddenly enough to get a strong reaction out of the player. You see this kind of thing in Five Nights at Freddy's. Even when you know an enemy is near you, it can still be quite alarming when they show up and a sound cue plays to freak you out. The final is what I'm going to refer to as emergency. This occurs when a player is actively terrified and is making immediate actions to remove or escape a threat. Sometimes it involves attacking and sometimes it involves fleeing. But in general, the player is so caught up in being scared that they don't have much time to think about anything other than resolving the threat. This can be seen in games like Soma. When spotted by the game's scary creature, the screen gets glitchy and music ramps up. It's then the player's job to quickly run and hide in order to exit the panic state. There are probably other scare tactics in games, but these 3 are, in my opinion, the most important. Now let's look at Friday the 13th's general gameplay. You play as a camp counselor trying to escape from Jason. In order to escape, you need to scavenge the camp for supplies. A lot of the time you will be alone, which sounds scary at first, but the game has been designed to diffuse all 3 of the scare tactics. First was anticipation. It is true that Jason can find you at any time, but chances are it'll take a while. Similar to many other Versus games, Friday the 13th is best played when the players have a deep understanding of how its systems work, which means that most players already know how unlikely it is that Jason will show up. This is all to say that players likely won't be anticipating him unless there are clear indicators that he's nearby, and by that point the anticipation is gone because the player already knows where he is. Now, because the player isn't expecting him to show up, that might sound like there are greater potentials for jump scares, but the game is sort of designed to make jump scares pretty much never happen. When Jason is within a certain radius of the player, music will play. It won't be a sudden strike of music, but instead it will fade in, starting out very quiet. The docile manner in which the music begins is gentle enough that it's not really that scary. Sometimes Jason will use his teleport or shift ability to be very suddenly near the player, which means that the music would start out very loud rather than fade in. While this sounds like it could scare, there's always a large buffer in advance. The game cribs on the original film's hammy novelty by occasionally showing screen distortion as if you were watching a movie through a VCR, but there's a mechanical purpose to this. It happens whenever Jason uses one of those abilities near the player. The game does this so that players never see Jason just pop up on screen. Basically, seeing static means that Jason is or was nearby. But this VCR static is very mild. It's never especially popping, nor does it make a loud noise. It's also, at least in my opinion, just long enough to diffuse any tension and put me into gear. It puts me on alert, but I can't say that it's ever scared me. And that brings us to emergency. If I'm on alert, I'm probably a little freaked out, right? Well, again, not really. Look at the pace of this game. Look at how slow Jason and the counselors run. It looks almost cartoonish how slow they're going. Don't get me wrong, I think this speed is necessary when you're considering all your options at this point in the game. If you're being chased, there's a lot to think about, but you usually have the time to put the thought into it. I wouldn't say that this is scary though. This doesn't mean tension can't be high as you play a game of cat and mouse with Jason, but I have trouble viewing this as scary or horror. This is especially true when the person playing as Jason turns it into a joke. It's not uncommon to communicate with players in the game, and oftentimes it makes for silly situations rather than scary ones. Even though Jason is your opponent, it establishes a friendly atmosphere that to me feels comparable to games like Mario Chase from Nintendo Land. Even though it's clearly not a horror game, it can still result in loud play between friends as players get really close to catching each other. The tension is super high and you might be screeching with delight with your friend, but I wouldn't call that horror. It might just be me, but that's just how I feel when playing Friday the 13th. delightedly tense rather than genuinely afraid. No matter how brutal Jason's kills are, this game has never kept me up at night. Some might disagree, but I just can't call this a horror game. I've never been scared while playing it, and it hasn't given me nightmares like most other things do. It's a fun strategy game with hammy horror themes rather than a truly scary game. And honestly, I feel like the game was designed with this in mind and is better for it. It's hard to focus on strategy and think rationally when you're scared, so while I don't think it would have failed as a horror game, I think it would have been far less nuanced in its design. If this game was designed to be a horror game, I don't think the strategy elements and systemic approach to inventory management would have worked. Instead of scavenging and making decisions about which items to keep, perhaps you would only need to go around searching for and solving simple tasks with occasional QuickTime events. I present this oddly specific example because I'm referring to another game, Dead by Daylight. A lot of people compare this game to Friday the 13th, and I can see why, but the differences are very evident, especially when it comes to the horror elements. In Dead by Daylight, you need to repair generators, but while doing this, you may get a sudden and difficult QuickTime event forcing you to react quickly. This creates anticipation. Instead of playing music, when the killer of this game is near you, it plays a heartbeat. For one thing, I think this is a much scarier sound than music, especially since it goes faster as they get nearer to you. For another, it's a lot easier to not hear a heartbeat than it is to not hear music, so when the killer does find you, it can catch you by surprise. This has potential for jump scares. The chases with the killer of this game are much more fast-paced and require quicker decisions. This is emergency. Plus, in general, the game's atmosphere is a lot darker. Where Friday the 13th uses various tropes from its source material, Dead by Daylight strives to make a genuinely scary atmosphere. Honestly, despite being regularly compared, these games have surprisingly little in common. But that's a topic for a different video. Main point, I just don't think Friday the 13th is a horror game. But what do you think? Would you call it a horror game? What about it, if anything, is scary to you? Leave a comment below and hit that subscribe button to stay tuned for more What's With Games. You can also follow me on Facebook and Twitter. Or if you're really interested, you can support my Patreon to get a bunch of neat exclusive stuff.